Imagine this: a routine traffic stop on a quiet afternoon turns into something much bigger than anyone could have predicted. A seasoned police officer, known for his tough demeanor and quick judgments, pulls over a sleek black car. He's done this 1,000 times before, but today is different. Today, he's about to make a mistake that will change everything. Behind the wheel sits a calm, composed black woman who hands over her license without hesitation. But from the moment he looks at her, you can feel the tension start to rise. He doesn't see a person, he sees a stereotype, a target for his frustration and misguided power. Without missing a beat, the officer's voice takes on a condescending tone. He throws out a series of sharp, cutting remarks about her appearance and the car she's driving, making assumptions about who she is and where she comes from. Each insult lands harder than the last, but through it all, she remains silent. Not a word, not a flinch. It's as if she knows something he doesn't. And oh, does she ever! Ass. The insults escalate. The officer feels invincible, completely unaware that the woman sitting in front of him is far from ordinary. She's not just another driver he can intimidate. In fact, she's the one person he should be showing the utmost respect to. But he doesn't. He just keeps going, digging himself deeper into a hole he won't be able to climb out of. All the while, the woman's calm demeanor never wavers. There's something about her quiet confidence that suggests she's got the upper hand, even if he doesn't realize it yet. But here's the twist: this woman isn't just any civilian. She's his boss. That's right, the woman he's been disrespecting and degrading is the very person who holds his career in her hands. And as she sits there, silently taking in his every word, you can almost feel the moment approaching when the tables are going to turn. She doesn't need to raise her voice or argue back. She knows the power dynamics are about to shift, and when they do, it's going to be unforgettable. Now picture this scene playing out in your head. The officer, cocky and oblivious, standing by her car window, throwing insults like they're nothing. He has no clue that he's digging his own grave with each word he says. The woman, composed and patient, waits. She knows it's only a matter of time before she reveals who she really is. And when that moment comes, it's going to hit him like a freight train. The audience is left wondering, how is he going to react? How far will he take it before he realizes his mistake? And what will she do next? Stay tuned, because this story is only getting started. You won't want to miss what happens when the truth comes out. The silence between them felt heavy, almost like the calm before a storm. The officer, oblivious to the weight of his words, continued to toss out veiled insults wrapped in false authority. His tone oozed with arrogance, as though he had already decided who she was. He leaned in closer to the car, the smirk on his face growing with every sarcastic remark. "This car doesn't seem like the kind of ride someone like you should be driving," he sneered, glancing at the spotless leather interior. "Got it on loan? Or maybe you're just borrowing it?" The woman didn't respond. She kept her gaze straight ahead, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. If his words bothered her, it didn't show. She'd been in situations like this before too many times, in fact. But something about this one felt different, more personal. Maybe it was the way the officer stood, the way he looked at her, as though he was certain he knew her story without even asking. But she knew better than to react. She had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than any retort. The officer's patience was wearing thin. Her quiet confidence irritated him. He wanted a reaction, any sign that he was getting under her skin. "You think you're too good to answer me?" he snapped, his voice raising just slightly. "Where are you headed? What's your business here?" He stepped back, putting his hands on his hips, as if that would intimidate her into speaking. She finally turned her head, meeting his gaze for the first time. There was a look in her eyes that made him pause, just for a second. It wasn't fear or anger, two reactions he was used to seeing. Instead, it was something much harder to read. It was almost like she was waiting for something. "I don't think that's relevant," she said calmly, her voice steady. "I wasn't speeding, and I haven't broken any laws. So I don't see why my destination matters." Her answer caught him off guard. He hadn't expected her to speak with such calm authority, and it threw him off balance. For a split second, he felt something close to doubt creep into his mind. But he shook it off. No, he was the one in control here. He wasn't about to let her dictate how this was going to go. "Oh, I think it's very relevant," he shot back, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're in my town, on my streets, and you're going to answer my questions." His words dripped with entitlement, the kind that comes from someone who's used to being in power, someone who believes they can bend the rules to suit their own purposes. The woman didn't flinch. She knew this type of man all too well, the kind who used his badge as a weapon, who thought the uniform made him untouchable. But she also knew that this was far from over. He was running out of ways to push her, and it was only a matter of time before he crossed a line he couldn't come back from. But she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of rattling her. Meanwhile, inside the officer's mind, doubts began to flicker like small embers, though he still believed he was in control. Who was this woman? How could she sit there, so composed, while he berated her? He wasn't used to people, especially women, standing up to him like this. It was unsettling, even if he'd never admit it. And still, he had no idea who he was really dealing with. The minutes stretched on, and every second of silence between them only built more tension. The woman remained quiet, knowing that he was growing more frustrated by the second. It was a test of wills now, and she was determined not to break. She had been here before, and she knew how to navigate these moments. She had more at stake than just a routine traffic stop. This was about something much bigger. The officer, however, didn't see it that way. In his mind, he was still in charge, and he was going to get the answers he wanted, one way or another. He leaned down, resting his arms on the edge of her window, his face just inches from hers now. "You know," he said, his voice low and threatening, "you're making this harder than it needs to be. If you'd just cooperate, we could both be on our way." There it was, his final play. The thinly veiled threat, the promise of things getting worse if she didn't comply. It was a tactic she'd seen before, and she wasn't surprised. But what he didn't know was that he was already far past the point of no return. With every word he spoke, every threat he made, he was sealing his own fate. She didn't look away. Instead, she let the silence linger for just a moment longer before speaking again, her voice still calm, but with a new edge to it. "I'm not making this harder," she said, her tone measured and precise. "But I think you are." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. For the first time, the officer faltered. He could feel something shifting, something he couldn't quite grasp. It was as if the ground beneath him was starting to slip away, but he couldn't see why. He stepped back from the car, running a hand through his hair, trying to regain his composure. But the woman knew it was too late for him. She could see the doubt creeping into his eyes, the hesitation in his movements. He was starting to realize that something was wrong, that he wasn't in control the way he thought he was. But he still didn't know the full extent of his mistake. Not yet. The officer cleared his throat, trying to mask his uncertainty. "I'll be right back," he muttered, walking back toward his patrol car, his mind racing. Something wasn't adding up. He needed to run her license, double-check her information, anything to make sense of the situation. He slid into the driver's seat of his car and started typing her information into the computer. And then, just as he hit enter, everything clicked into place. Her name, her title, her position. It was right there, staring back at him on the screen. The blood drained from his face as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He wasn't dealing with just anyone. She wasn't just another driver. She was the new precinct chief, his boss. Panic flooded his mind, as he tried to process what he'd done. All those insults, the disrespect, the threats, he had said them all to the person who had the power to end his career in a single stroke. His hands started to shake as the full weight of his mistake settled over him. He had crossed the line, and there was no way to undo it now. But what was she going to do? Would she let it slide, or would she make an example out of him? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. He could already imagine the fallout, the disciplinary actions, the humiliation. How could he have been so blind? So arrogant? He glanced back at the woman in the car, her face still calm, her eyes watching him through the rearview mirror. She knew. She had known all along. And now, he was the one who had to wait, trapped in the uncertainty of what would happen next. The story was far from over, and as the officer sat there, his heart pounding in his chest, he realized that he was no longer in control of the narrative. She was. The officer sat in his patrol car, staring at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of what he'd just discovered felt like a lead blanket draped over his shoulders. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the details in front of him. This woman wasn't just any random driver. She was the new precinct chief, his direct superior. She was the one who held his future, his job, in her hands. And he had insulted her, humiliated her, all without realizing who he was talking to. The panic clawed at his throat as he tried to process what he had done. For a moment, he considered just walking back to the car, apologizing, and praying she would let it go. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was useless. He had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. Every word he had said, every insult he had thrown, replayed in his mind, only now they sounded so much worse. The condescension in his voice, the sneer in his tone, it all seemed so reckless now that he knew who she was. He swallowed hard, feeling the bile rise in his throat as he glanced up at her car. She hadn't moved. She was still sitting there, calm, composed, and utterly in control. It was like she knew exactly what was happening, like she had been waiting for him to figure it out. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him, even though her eyes were fixed ahead. The way she had held herself throughout the entire encounter, it all made sense now. She had known from the very beginning that he didn't realize who she was. And now, she was just waiting for him to make his move. The officer's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing through possible outcomes. What could he do? Was there any way to salvage this situation? He could apologize, of course, but would that be enough? Would she even listen to him after everything he had said? The fear gnawed at him, making it hard to think clearly. His career, everything he had worked for, was hanging in the balance, and he knew it. One wrong word, one more misstep, and it would all be over. He glanced down at his radio, his finger hovering over the button. He could call for backup, try to bring someone else into the situation, but what good would that do? It would only draw more attention to his mistake. No, he was on his own. He had to figure this out. But how? Back in the car, the woman remained steady. She hadn't moved, hadn't said another word, but the tension in the air was palpable. She was waiting, giving him time to realize the gravity of his situation. She didn't need to rush. The power dynamics had already shifted in her favor, and she knew it. Now, it was up to him to see how far he would go before the truth hit him full force. The officer took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. His palms were slick with sweat as he wiped them on his uniform pants. He had to do something, but every option felt like walking on a razor's edge. He couldn't just walk away. That would be seen as cowardice, or worse, as if he had something to hide. He couldn't escalate the situation. Either he had already pushed things too far, and any further would only seal his fate. For the first time in his career, he felt completely out of his depth. He had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing how to handle any situation. But this was different. The balance of power had shifted so suddenly, so completely, that he could barely catch his breath. He was on the defensive now, and he knew that any wrong move could be his last. He finally forced himself to get out of the car, though his legs felt heavy and unsteady. His steps were slower this time, lacking the confidence he'd had earlier. He walked back toward her car, each step echoing the thud of his heartbeat in his ears. When he reached her window, he hesitated, unsure of what to say, unsure of what she was waiting for. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment they just stared at each other. The silence between them stretched on, thick and heavy, and the officer felt the weight of it pressing down on him. He knew he had to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He had always been the one in control, the one who set the rules. But now he was lost. He started, but his voice caught in his throat. He cleared it, trying again. "I need to apologize," he said, his voice quieter now, lacking the bravado it had carried before. "I didn't realize who you were." But the woman didn't respond. She just watched him, her eyes steady, as if she was waiting for him to say something more. It was unnerving, that calmness, that composure. It made him feel small, insignificant, and for the first time, he realized how much power she truly held. She didn't need to shout or threaten. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her silence was enough. The officer swallowed again, his throat dry. "I made a mistake," he admitted, the words feeling heavy as they left his mouth. "I was out of line. I shouldn't have spoken to you that way." Still, she said nothing, her gaze unwavering. The silence was unbearable now, the tension thick in the air. Every second felt like it stretched on forever, and the officer could feel the panic rising in his chest again. Was this it? Was his apology too little, too late? What was she thinking? What was she going to do? His mind raced with possibilities. Would she file a report? Would she go straight to the chief? He could already imagine the consequences, the disciplinary actions, the hearings. His career was on the line, and all he could do was stand there, waiting for her to make the next move. But she didn't. Not yet. She just sat there, letting him stew in the mess he had created. She knew she didn't have to do anything more. The damage was already done, and he was the one who would have to live with the consequences. The officer's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, trapped in the tension of the moment. He felt completely powerless, a feeling he wasn't used to. His entire career had been built on authority, on being the one in charge. But now, that authority had crumbled beneath him, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. As the seconds dragged on, he realized that the woman wasn't going to let him off easily. She wasn't going to accept his apology with a nod and send him on his way. No, this was bigger than just a few words of regret. She was making a point, showing him that actions have consequences, that his power was only as strong as the respect he showed others. And right now, he had none. The woman finally turned her head, looking away from him, her gaze shifting toward the horizon, as if contemplating her next move. It was subtle, but in that small gesture, the officer felt a wave of dread wash over him. He knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The officer stood there, his breath shallow, waiting for her to speak, waiting for something to happen. But the longer she remained silent, the more the tension grew. It was suffocating now, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him with each passing second. Then, just when the silence became unbearable, she spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, but there was a finality to it that sent a chill down his spine. "You don't get to decide when this is over." The officer's heart skipped a beat. The full impact of her words hit him like a hammer. He wasn't in control here. She was. And she wasn't about to let him walk away unscathed. In that moment, he realized that the worst was yet to come. This wasn't just about his apology or his regret. It was about the choices he had made, the power he had used, and the lesson she was about to teach him. And as the woman rolled up her window, leaving him standing there in stunned silence, the officer knew one thing for sure: His life, his career, everything he had taken for granted, was about to change forever. As the officer stood there, the woman's words still echoing in his mind, he felt a sudden rush of fear tighten around his chest. His mind was racing, but his body was frozen in place, unable to react. He had been trained to handle high-pressure situations, but this was different. This wasn't about control or authority anymore. This was about survival. The kind of survival that didn't involve weapons or force, but something far more terrifying: his career, his future, his reputation. The woman had made it clear he didn't get to decide when this was over. And with that simple statement, the entire dynamic had shifted. She wasn't just his boss anymore. She was something more, something that represented the consequences of every careless action he'd ever taken. The weight of it was crushing. But as he stood there, trying to figure out his next move, something else began to gnaw at him, a realization that crept in slowly, like a cold chill crawling up his spine. He had made assumptions about her, but what if he had overlooked something even more important? What if she was waiting for him to make another mistake? What if this wasn't just about this one traffic stop? The officer's mind churned with possibilities. What if she had been watching him for longer than just today? What if his behavior had been under scrutiny for weeks, months, even years? He knew he wasn't the cleanest cop on the force. No one was. But what if she had been brought in specifically because of him? The thought made his heart race even faster. He tried to steady his breathing, but the fear only grew with each passing second. He wasn't just dealing with a superior who had caught him in a moment of arrogance. He was dealing with someone who might know far more than he realized. Someone who had the power to take everything away from him, not just because of this one mistake, but because of everything he had ever done. He forced himself to move, finally taking a step back toward his patrol car. But his legs felt heavy, almost like they were made of lead. His mind flashed through every interaction he'd had in recent months. Every questionable call, every cutting remark, every instance where he had used his position to intimidate rather than protect. Had she been watching? Had she already decided his fate before he even knew who she was? He got into his car and slammed the door shut, but it did nothing to quiet the storm raging in his head. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the dark leather. The silence in the car was deafening, the weight of his uncertainty pressing down on him with unbearable force. He needed answers. He needed to know how deep this went, how much she knew, and whether there was any way to salvage the situation. But as he stared at the dashboard, trying to formulate a plan, a new thought struck him, a thought so dark, so twisted, that he almost recoiled from it. What if she had set him up? What if this whole situation had been engineered to expose him? The idea seemed absurd at first, but the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. What were the chances that he would pull over his own boss without knowing who she was on a random traffic stop? What were the odds that she would stay so calm, so composed, while he made mistake after mistake? It felt too perfect, too orchestrated. What if she had planned this all along, knowing exactly how he would react? The officer's breath came in shallow gasps now, his paranoia spiraling out of control. If she had set him up, if she had known all along what kind of cop he was, then there was nothing he could do. She had him cornered, and he was powerless to stop it. His thoughts raced back to every conversation he had overheard at the station, every hushed rumor about changes coming, about cleaning up the department. He had always brushed it off as meaningless gossip, but now it felt like the pieces were falling into place. She was new to the precinct, sure, but that didn't mean she hadn't done her homework. Maybe she had been sent specifically to deal with officers like him, officers who had taken advantage of the system for too long. And now, here she was, sitting in her car like a predator, waiting for her prey to make the wrong move. The officer's pulse pounded in his ears as he tried to think of a way out, but the walls were closing in. He was trapped, and he knew it. The only question now was how far she would take it. Would she file a report? Would she drag him through an internal investigation? Or worse, had she already gathered enough evidence to bury him without even needing to say another word? As the dread settled deep in his gut, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a movement, subtle but unmistakable. The woman's car door was opening. She was getting out. His heart skipped a beat as he watched her step out of the vehicle, her every movement deliberate, calculated. She wasn't in a rush. She didn't need to be. She was in control, and she knew it. She walked toward his car with the same calm composure she had shown during the entire encounter, her expression unreadable. The officer's throat went dry as she approached, and he instinctively reached for the door handle, unsure of what she was planning to do. But she didn't stop at his door. Instead, she walked past it, heading toward the front of his patrol car, her gaze fixed ahead as if she had something specific in mind. For a brief moment, he thought she was leaving, that maybe she had decided to let him off with nothing more than the fear he had already experienced. But then she stopped, right in front of his vehicle. She turned to face him, her eyes locking with his through the windshield. Time seemed to slow down. The officer's pulse quickened as he stared back at her, completely at a loss for what to do next. Then, without a word, she reached into her pocket and pulled something out. His heart leaped into his throat as he strained to see what it was. A phone. She was holding a phone. His mind raced. Was she going to call someone? Was she recording him? What was happening? But before he could process it fully, she did something that shocked him to his core. She raised the phone, tapped a button, and suddenly, a voice crackled through his car's radio. It wasn't just any voice, it was hers. "This is Chief," she said, her tone firm, authoritative. "I'm requesting immediate backup at my location. Officer needs assistance." The officer's blood ran cold. She wasn't just calling for backup, she was calling him out. His entire world tilted on its axis as he realized what was happening. She had used his own radio to request assistance, making it clear that she was the one in charge here, not him. And now, there was no way to cover up what had happened. When backup arrived, they would see everything: the power imbalance, the way he had treated her, the way he had dug his own grave. He could already hear the sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. His breath came in short, panicked bursts as he struggled to figure out what to do next. This was it. The moment of reckoning. He was cornered, and there was no escape. The woman lowered the phone and met his gaze again, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say anything more. The message was clear: he had lost control, and now he would face the consequences of his actions. The officer's heart raced as the sirens grew louder, closer. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to do something, to try and fix this, but there was nothing left to do. The game was over, and he had lost. As the first patrol car pulled up behind him, his pulse pounded in his ears. He felt like he was watching the end of his career unfold in slow motion, powerless to stop it. The other officers got out of their vehicles, approaching cautiously, not sure what to expect. And then, as if the universe wasn't finished with him yet, the second plot twist hit, the one he never saw coming. The officers who arrived on the scene weren't just any officers. They were internal affairs. The woman had called in the watchdogs, and now he was truly cornered. This wasn't just about his behavior during this one stop. This was about everything. Every misstep, every abuse of power, every moment when he had crossed the line. And now, it was all coming back to haunt him. The officer's mind spun as the internal affairs team approached, their faces grim and unreadable. He had heard rumors about these investigations before, but he had never imagined he would be at the center of one. And now, here he was, standing on the precipice of losing everything. His career, his reputation, his life as he knew it, it was all on the line. The woman stood there, watching as the internal affairs officers spoke to him, her expression calm and composed. She had orchestrated the entire thing, setting him up in a way he never could have anticipated. And now, there was no way out. As the officers began asking questions, the officer's heart sank. This was the beginning of the end, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The officer's pulse hammered in his ears as the internal affairs officers approached. Every step they took felt like the tolling of a bell, counting down the seconds of his career, his life as he knew it. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, their measured expressions giving nothing away, but he knew. He knew this was the moment he had always feared, the one he had tried to ignore, thinking it would never come. The woman, his boss, stood silently by, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a calm, detached expression. Her presence loomed over everything, like the final judge in a trial where he had no defense. She had orchestrated it all, and now, as the officers surrounded him, the realization hit him full force. She had never needed to raise her voice or lose her temper. She had controlled everything from the moment he stopped her. One of the internal affairs officers, a tall man with a steely gaze, stepped forward. "Officer," he said, his voice level but commanding, "we're going to need you to step out of your vehicle." The words sent a chill through him. He could feel his hands trembling on the steering wheel, his mind scrambling for a way out. He thought about refusing, about arguing his case, but the presence of so many witnesses made it clear that any defiance would only dig him deeper into the hole he had already dug for himself. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. His gaze darted toward his boss, hoping for some sign of leniency, but her expression didn't change. She remained calm, composed, as if this was just another routine day. The tall officer nodded to one of his colleagues, and the second officer, a woman with sharp eyes, approached him, clipboard in hand. "We've been investigating reports of misconduct in this precinct," she said, her voice brisk and professional. "We'll be asking you a few questions about your recent actions, as well as your history with the department." His heart sank. This was more than just about today's traffic stop. They had been investigating him. For how long? What had they found? He could already feel the walls closing in, and he knew there was no easy way out of this. The questions started, rapid fire, probing into his actions during the stop. Why had he escalated the situation? Why had he spoken to the woman the way he did? He tried to defend himself, tried to explain that he hadn't known who she was, that he had been caught off guard, but the excuses sounded hollow even to his own ears. The more he spoke, the more he realized that nothing he said would change the outcome. But then, as the interrogation continued, something shifted. One of the internal affairs officers, a man with a more thoughtful expression, flipped through the pages of his file and paused, his brow furrowing slightly. He glanced up at the officer, then back down at the file, as if something didn't quite add up. "Tell me about the incident 2 months ago," the officer said, his tone more curious than accusatory. "The one involving the domestic disturbance call. You were first on the scene, correct?" The officer felt his stomach drop. He knew exactly what they were referring to. It was an incident that had been swept under the rug, something he had thought was long forgotten. But here it was, resurfacing at the worst possible moment. He hesitated, trying to choose his words carefully. "I responded to a call," he began, his voice shaky. "There was a misunderstanding. The situation got tense, and I had to make a split-second decision." The internal affairs officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "A split-second decision that led to a civilian being hospitalized," he said. "And from what I can see, the internal report was vague at best." "Care to explain that?" The officer felt the noose tightening around his neck. He had hoped that incident would never come to light again, but now it was being used against him, adding weight to the pile of evidence stacking up against him. His mind raced, trying to think of a way to salvage the situation, but there was no escaping the truth. He had crossed the line more than once, and now it was all coming back to haunt him. Just as the weight of the situation threatened to crush him completely, the woman, his boss, finally stepped forward. The internal affairs officers turned to her, clearly waiting to hear what she had to say. The officer braced himself, expecting her to lay out the final damning evidence that would seal his fate. But instead, she surprised him. "Before we move forward," she said, her voice steady and controlled, "I want to make something clear. Today's incident isn't just about one officer's actions. It's about the culture of this department and the accountability, or lack thereof, that has been allowed to persist." The officer blinked, trying to process her words. What was she saying? Was she defending him? She continued, her gaze sweeping across the other officers and the internal affairs team. "I was brought in to address systemic issues, and what happened today is a symptom of a much larger problem. But that doesn't mean individual responsibility should be ignored." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. She wasn't letting him off the hook, but she wasn't throwing him to the wolves either. There was something more going on here, something bigger than just his mistakes. One of the internal affairs officers cleared his throat. "What are you suggesting, Chief?" She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm suggesting that while this officer's actions today were unacceptable, we need to take a broader look at how this precinct operates. I've seen enough to know that he's not the only one who has crossed lines." The officer's mind reeled. What was happening? Was she shifting the focus away from him? Was this some kind of strategic move? He couldn't tell, but one thing was clear: she wasn't letting anyone off easily. The internal affairs team exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about how to proceed. The tension in the air was thick, and the officer could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was caught between relief and dread, unsure of what would come next. Finally, the tall officer nodded slowly. "We'll conduct a full review of the department," he said. "But that doesn't change the fact that we have an issue here that needs to be addressed." The woman, the chief, nodded in agreement. "Agreed. But let's not make any hasty decisions without understanding the full picture." The officer couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was this a reprieve? Was she buying him time? Or was she simply ensuring that the blame would be shared among others? He couldn't tell, but for the first time since the stop began, he felt a glimmer of hope. But then, just as the tension seemed to ease, the final twist hit. One of the internal affairs officers, the woman with the sharp eyes, stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the chief. "Chief," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a knife, "there's something you should know. We've been reviewing your file as well." The chief's expression didn't change, but there was a brief flicker of something in her eyes, something the officer couldn't quite place. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by her usual calm demeanor. The sharp-eyed officer continued, her voice measured. "You've only been with this precinct for a short time, but there are discrepancies in your record. Things that don't add up." The officer's heart skipped a beat. What was she talking about? Discrepancies in the chief's record? How could that be possible? The internal affairs officer reached into her file and pulled out a document, holding it up for the chief to see. "We found evidence that suggests you may not have been entirely forthcoming about your background. There are gaps in your employment history and certain claims that don't match up with official records." The chief's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained silent, her gaze locked on the document. The officer watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about her. The woman who had seemed untouchable, unshakable, was now under scrutiny herself. The internal affairs officer pressed on. "We're not accusing you of anything yet, but given the circumstances, we'll be conducting a thorough investigation into your background as well." For a moment, the air was thick with tension, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone present. The officer couldn't believe what he was seeing. The chief, his boss, the woman who'd seemed so in control, was now facing her own reckoning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the chief nodded slowly. "Do what you need to do," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I have nothing to hide." The internal affairs team nodded and began to gather their files, clearly preparing to leave. But the officer could see it in their eyes. This wasn't over. Not for him, and not for the chief. The investigation had only just begun. As the team left, the officer stood there, staring at his boss. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. There was no warmth, no reassurance, just a cold, hard look that told him everything he needed to know. They were both in this now, caught in the same web of scrutiny and investigation. The tables had turned, and the final twist had left them both standing on uncertain ground. But as the chief turned and walked away, the officer couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end.